Sofia had always loved the city. Its vibrant energy, the thrumming pulse of life that coursed through its streets and subways. She had lived in New York for 3 years now, and the subway was her daily companion. It was a place of mundane routines where people came and went, lost in their own worlds. But tonight, the subway felt different. The usual hum of conversation and the clatter of the train wheels on the tracks were absent. It was late, much later than Sofia normally stayed out, but she had lost track of time at a friend's birthday party. Now, she stood on the platform of a nearly deserted station, waiting for the last train home. The cold air bit at her skin, and she pulled her coat tighter around her. A flickering light above cast eerie shadows on the walls. Sofia glanced around, feeling a prickle of unease. Only a few stragglers shared the platform with her, a homeless man muttering to himself, a couple huddled together, and a tall man in a dark coat standing too still, his face hidden by the brim of his hat. Sofia tried to shake off the feeling of being watched and checked her phone. No signal, of course. She sighed and looked down the tunnel, willing the train to appear. The man in the dark coat hadn't moved. His presence gnawed at her nerves. She stole another glance at him, and this time their eyes met. His were cold, empty, and seemed to bore into her soul. She quickly looked away, her heart pounding. Finally, the train arrived with a rush of wind and a screech of metal. Sofia stepped on board, feeling a rush of relief. She chose a seat in the middle of the car, near the exit. The car was almost empty. Just an old woman asleep with her head against the window and a young man absorbed in his music. The doors slid shut with a clang, and the train lurched forward. Sofia leaned back and closed her eyes, trying to shake off the strange encounter. She listened to the rhythmic clatter of the train, a sound that usually soothed her. But tonight, it only heightened her anxiety. She opened her eyes and glanced around. The man in the dark coat was there, sitting at the far end, staring at her. Her stomach twisted in fear. She tried to ignore him, telling herself she was being paranoid. But with each passing station, he stayed on the train. He never looked away, his gaze fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Sofia's mind raced. Was he following her? Was it just a coincidence? She needed to get off this train. But what if he followed? At the next station, she decided to act. She stood up quickly, gripping her bag tightly, and moved toward the door. The man stood up too. Panic surged through her. As the doors opened, she bolted out, not looking back. She heard footsteps behind her, quick and deliberate. Sofia ran, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She darted up the stairs, her heart hammering in her chest. She emerged onto a deserted street, the city strangely silent around her. She could still hear him, his footsteps echoing hers. She glanced over her shoulder. He was gaining on her. Sofia's fear turned to desperation. She had to find a place to hide. She spotted an alleyway and ducked into it, pressing herself against the wall, trying to quiet her breathing. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Sofia bit her lip to keep from sobbing. She could see his shadow at the entrance of the alley, stretching long and menacing in the dim light. He paused, and for a moment she thought he might have lost her. But then he started down the alley, slow and methodical, as if savoring the hunt. Sofia's mind raced. There was nowhere to run. She felt the cold stone of the wall behind her, unyielding and indifferent. She closed her eyes, praying he wouldn't see her. The footsteps stopped. She opened her eyes just a sliver and saw him standing there, at the mouth of the alley, looking straight at her. He smiled, a chilling, predatory smile. Sofia's breath caught in her throat. She was trapped. The man took a step toward her, and then another. Sofia backed away, her hands trembling. She tripped over a loose brick and fell, her ankle twisting painfully. she cried out, the sound echoing off the walls. The man loomed over her now, his shadow swallowing her whole. Sophia's mind went blank with terror. She tried to crawl away, but he grabbed her arm, his grip like iron. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the night. He pulled her to her feet, his face inches from hers. His breath was hot and foul. "Why are you following me?" she managed to gasp, her voice shaking. He didn't answer. Instead, he pulled her closer, his eyes devoid of any human warmth. Sophia struggled, but he was too strong. She felt a surge of helplessness, a sense of being utterly alone. In that moment, she realized no one was coming to save her. But then, from the darkness, a voice called out, "Hey, let her go." The man turned, and Sophia saw a figure at the entrance of the alley, a tall, burly man with a flashlight. Her attacker hesitated, his grip loosening just enough for Sophia to wrench herself free. She stumbled toward her would-be savior, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and relief. The man in the dark coat backed away, his cold eyes flickering with something like rage. Then he turned and fled, disappearing into the night. Sophia collapsed against the wall, her whole body trembling. The man with the flashlight approached her, concern etched on his face. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice gentle. Sophia nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Thank you." He helped her to her feet, supporting her as they made their way out of the alley. "Let's get you somewhere safe," he said. "You shouldn't be alone right now." Sophia leaned on him, her body weak with exhaustion and fear. They walked in silence, the city's usual noise gradually returning around them. As they reached a more populated area, she felt a sense of safety returning, though the fear still lingered. The man led her to his car, a beat-up sedan parked on the side of the road. "I'm Daniel," he said, opening the passenger door for her. "I can give you a ride home. It's not safe for you to be out here alone." Sophia hesitated, but Daniel's reassuring presence made her feel a bit more at ease. She nodded and got into the car, sinking into the seat with a sigh of relief. Daniel got behind the wheel and started the engine, the car rumbling to life. "Where do you live?" he asked, pulling away from the curb. Sophia gave him her address, and they drove in silence for a few minutes. The city lights blurred past, and Sophia began to relax, the adrenaline slowly leaving her system. She glanced at Daniel, who seemed focused on the road. "Thank you again," she said softly. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't shown up." Daniel smiled, though it seemed strained. "Just glad I was there in time." As they drove, Sophia noticed they were heading away from the city center, the buildings growing sparser and the streets darker. She frowned, a sense of unease creeping back in. "This isn't the way to my apartment," she said, trying to keep her voice calm. Daniel's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "I know a safer route," he replied, his tone too casual. "Trust me." Sophia's heart began to race again. She glanced out the window, realizing they were heading toward the outskirts of the city, an area she was unfamiliar with. Panic started to bubble up inside her. "I think you should turn around," she said, her voice shaking. Daniel didn't respond. Instead, he drove faster, the car speeding down the deserted road. Sophia's fear turned to terror. She reached for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. The doors were locked. "Let me out," she screamed, pounding on the window. Daniel glanced at her, his eyes cold and devoid of any warmth. "Calm down, Sophia. You're not going anywhere." Sophia's mind raced. She was trapped. She had to find a way out. She looked around the car, searching for anything she could use as a weapon. But the car was empty, nothing within reach. They drove for what felt like hours, the city long behind them. Finally, they pulled up to an abandoned building, its windows boarded up and the paint peeling off the walls. Daniel got out and came around to her side, opening the door and dragging her out. Sofia fought, kicking and screaming, but Daniel was too strong. He pulled her inside the building, the darkness swallowing them. The air was damp and cold, and the silence was suffocating. He shoved her into a small, dimly lit room and locked the door behind her. Sofia banged on the door, screaming for help, but there was no one to hear her. She sank to the floor, tears streaming down her face. Hours passed, or maybe it was days. Time lost all meaning. Daniel brought her food and water, but he barely spoke, his expression unreadable. Sofia felt like a prisoner, trapped in a nightmare with no escape. One night, as she lay on the cold, hard floor, she heard voices outside the door. Daniel and another man, their words muffled but urgent. Sofia pressed her ear to the door, trying to make out what they were saying. "We can't keep her here forever," the other man was saying. "Someone will come looking for her." "We'll move her soon," Daniel replied. "Just need to make sure it's safe." Sofia's heart leapt. This was her chance. She waited until their voices faded, then began searching the room for any way out. She found a loose board in the floor and pried it up, revealing a narrow crawl space. It was a tight fit, but it was her only hope. She squeezed through the opening, the rough wood scraping her skin. The crawl space led to another room, this one empty and silent. She moved as quietly as she could, her heart pounding in her chest. Finally, she found a window. It was boarded up, but she managed to pull the boards loose, one by one. She climbed out, the night air cold against her skin. She took a deep breath, her first taste of freedom in what felt like an eternity. Sofia ran, her feet pounding against the ground. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew she had to get away. She stumbled through the darkness, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The narrow crawl space had scratched her skin raw, and her legs ached from running, but the adrenaline coursing through her veins pushed her forward. The moon was her only source of light as she emerged from the abandoned building into the dense forest that surrounded it. The trees stood tall and imposing, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. She could hear the shouts of Daniel and the other man behind her, their voices filled with anger and menace. "Where do you think you're going, Sofia?" Daniel's voice called out, cold and taunting. "You can't hide forever. We'll find you." Sofia's heart pounded in her chest. She veered off the road and into the forest, the thick underbrush scratching at her legs. She kept running, branches whipping against her face, her breaths coming in desperate gasps. She knew she had to put as much distance between herself and her pursuers as possible. After a few minutes, she found a large tree with thick foliage and ducked behind it, pressing her body against the rough bark. She tried to quiet her breathing, the sound of her own heart like a drum in her ears. She could hear them getting closer, their footsteps crunching on the leaves and twigs. "Come out, Sofia!" the man shouted, his voice filled with malice. "You know we're going to find you, and when we do, it's going to be a lot worse for you." Sofia bit down on her lip to keep from sobbing. Tears streamed down her face, her body trembling with fear. She tried to stay as still as possible, praying they wouldn't find her. "You think hiding is going to save you?" Daniel's voice was closer now, filled with a chilling calm. "We're going to catch you, Sofia, and when we do, you'll wish you had come out on your own." Sofia's mind raced. She couldn't stay here. They were too close. She had to move, had to find another hiding spot. She waited until their voices were a little farther away, then carefully crept around the tree and slipped deeper into the forest. She moved as quietly as she could, her heart in her throat. She found another tree, its trunk wide and offering a decent hiding spot. She crouched down, hugging her knees to her chest, trying to make herself as small as possible. Her body was shaking uncontrollably, her sobs silent and her breath shallow. She could hear the men searching, their threats growing more violent. "When we find you, Sofia, we're going to make you pay," the man snarled. "We're going to break you, piece by piece." Daniel's voice was colder, more menacing. "You think you can run from us? There's no escape, Sofia. We're going to find you, and when we do, it'll be worse than anything you can imagine." Sofia felt like she was drowning in fear. She shifted her position slightly, trying to get a better view of her surroundings. The forest was dark and unforgiving, but she knew it was her only hope. She waited until their voices faded again before moving once more. She crept through the underbrush, careful to avoid making noise. The forest seemed to close in around her, the darkness thick and oppressive. She kept moving, her legs burning with effort. She found another hiding spot, a cluster of bushes that offered some cover. She crouched down, her whole body shaking with fear. She could hear them again, their voices angry and frustrated. They were searching methodically, determined to find her. Sofia clamped a hand over her mouth to stifle her sobs, tears streaming down her face. She couldn't let them catch her. She had to keep moving. She waited until they were a little farther away, then slipped out of her hiding spot and moved deeper into the forest. The trees grew denser, the underbrush thicker. She pushed through, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her body aching with exhaustion. Finally, she reached a part of the forest that was so dense she could barely see in front of her. She stumbled over roots and rocks, her legs trembling with fatigue. She found a small hollow under a large tree and crawled inside, curling up as small as she could. She was deep in the forest now, far from the road and any sign of those men. The night passed in a blur of fear and exhaustion. Sofia lay in her hiding spot, too afraid to sleep, her mind replaying the events of the night over and over. Every noise, every rustle of leaves made her jump. She stayed there, hidden and silent, her body aching and her mind exhausted. As dawn broke, the forest began to lighten. Sofia waited, listening intently for any sign of her pursuers. The forest was quiet, the only sounds the chirping of birds and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. She cautiously crawled out of her hiding spot, her body stiff and sore. She made her way back toward the road, moving slowly and carefully. The forest was still thick, but the light made it easier to navigate. She reached the edge of the forest and saw the road in the distance. Relief flooded through her, but she knew she wasn't safe yet. She walked along the road, her eyes scanning for any sign of danger. After what felt like hours, she saw a car approaching. She waved her arms frantically, tears of relief streaming down her face. The car slowed and pulled over, the driver, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, stepping out. "Are you okay?" the woman asked, her voice filled with concern. Sofia nodded, though she was barely holding herself together. "Please, help me. I need to get to the police." The woman ushered her into the car and drove her to the nearest police station. Sofia told the officers everything, her voice shaking with fear and relief. They assured her she was safe now, that they would find Daniel and the other man. Sofia leaned back in the chair, her body finally relaxing. She was safe. The nightmare was over, but the fear still lingered, a dark shadow that would take time to fade. She had survived the night, but she knew it would take much longer to heal from the trauma of her ordeal. The city she had once loved now felt like a distant memory, a place of danger and darkness. But she was determined to rebuild her life, to find a way to feel safe again. And she knew she would never take her safety for granted again. If you like Sofia's harrowing tale of survival and suspense, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more spine-chilling stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Remember, sometimes the real monsters wear the faces of those we trust. Stay vigilant, stay safe, and good night.